Hello and welcome to Dialogue. More than 5,200 people have been killed so far in the conflict between Palestine and Israel, which began October 7th. Meanwhile, Egypt announces it will open the Rafah border crossing to allow limited humanitarian aid to enter the besieged Gaza Strip. What's behind the latest fighting? How likely could the current conflict escalate into a regional war? And after the U.S. vetoed the UN's call for a humanitarian pause, how to prevent the growing humanitarian crisis in the territory? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Peter Kuznick, Professor of History at American University, and Wang Jin, Associate Professor at Northwest University of China, and Mayor Java Danfa, Middle East analyst based in Israel. And that's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, welcome to Dialogue. Peter, I will start with you. So what's the latest humanitarian situation like in the Gaza, in particular, in the area, with missile strikes here?
Did you want me to answer that?
Yes, Peter, you can hear me now?
Yes. Well, the latest situation is pretty dire right now. The humanitarian aid has not been getting in. Israel has imposed a blockade, really, of food, fuel, energy, electricity. At least, according to the World Health Organization, at least 115 healthcare facilities have been hit already by Israeli bombs. We saw the terrible developments at the hospital there. And so Israel has been bombing very, very aggressively inside of Gaza and has been demanding that the population in the northern part of Gaza move south. However, that's an almost impossible task. They want to move 1.1 million people from the north to the south. When people get to the south, they've got no place to stay, and they're bombing in the south as well. So what we're seeing is the beginning of a humanitarian catastrophe inside of Gaza. If Israel invades, it's only going to get worse, far, far worse.
Mm-hmm. Peter, if we can go back a little bit, let's take a look at, the latest round of a crisis or tension came after Hamas launched attack inside Israel. People say that's the first direct conflict inside Israel since the 1948 war between Arab and Israeli states there. Tell us, what is behind the move by Hamas?
Let me first say that the Hamas attack was unconscionable. To kill 260 people celebrating at a rave, at a dance party, and then to murder babies and women and old people is just horrific. However, it's the perfect timing because Israel is in disarray. Netanyahu's extreme right-wing government with the judicial reform, has divided Israeli society in a way we've really never seen before. At the same time, Netanyahu has moved the troops from the Gaza area up to the north because the settlers have been attacking the Palestinian civilians in the West Bank as they take more and more land and expand their settlements. So they were unprepared militarily, unprepared intelligence-wise, unprepared politically. On top of that, Israel's main backer, the United States, is also in political disarray. First of all, its focus was on Ukraine, really, and to some extent Taiwan. And at the same time, that Congress is not functioning in the United States. Besides that, the timing is important because they're trying to scuttle this rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Iran has condemned it, and if that deal goes through, then they'll have not only the UAE and Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Israel, but other states in the region are likely to follow. So those are three of the major factors in terms of understanding the timing. But Israel is very weakened right now, and the United States is distracted. So they picked the proper time for this kind of attack.
Wang Jin, there's a finger pointing inside Israel at either the failure of the intelligence or the national leadership, meaning Prime Minister Netanyahu. What do you make of that?
I think, yes, from its perspective of Israeli side, is this sudden attack from the Hamas in Gaza against Israel territories could be to some extent attributed as concluded as the very failure of both Israeli intelligence systems as well as, of course, the government led by Benjamin Netanyahu himself. Because on the one hand, Benjamin Netanyahu, or we call Bibi for short, he describes himself as always as the Mr. Security, and his government, which organized ever since the very end of the last year, was maybe the most ultra right-wing and right-wing government inside Israel, even in Israeli history. So that is why a lot of people once believed that their government was strong, their government was very assertive, and their government could have the capabilities to secure their own civilians and citizens. But then look at what happened that during the past weeks, the Israeli people, they witnessed a lot of the casualties and deaths and the disasters of their civilians after the attack from Hamas. So this is, of course, a very bad news for Israelis. And on the other hand, we cannot forget that after this round of attack, the both sides, especially after the Israeli launched a counterattack against the targets inside Gaza, that also led to larger waves of humanitarian crisis as well as larger numbers of casualties of civilians, of Palestinians inside Gaza. So actually, it's led to both sides. They suffered a lot, especially the civilians suffered a lot. So I think this kind of the failure we talk about Israelis, the intelligence failure or the government failure, it is one thing. But then we cannot forget the disasters of the both sides, because in the war, in the confrontations, only civilians suffered, only the people suffered. So that is the people, they will pay the price of the war.
Well, speak of that, Peter, back to you. The UN Secretary General is calling for a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, so the outside can provide us the necessary assistance to the civilians. And then in the UN Security Council, there is a resolution proposed by the Brazilians, basically to calling for similar calling for a pause, a humanitarian pause. The U.S. Was the only country against such a resolution. What is the explanation? How can people explain, what's wrong with the ceasefire here?
Well, in the vote was 12 in favor of the resolution, 2 abstentions, and the U.S. opposing it. The U.S. has always had Israel's back in the United Nations, and the U.S. UN ambassador said the reason was to let diplomacy work out. Well, that's really laughable. This is not about diplomacy right now. This is about giving Israel carte blanche to go in there and exact a toll on the Gazan population. Israel does not want to be stopped right now. There's a very strong feeling on part of the Israelis that this is their opportunity to wipe out Hamas, and they want to take it. But there's a lot of opposition to that. Opposition globally, some opposition within Israel, opposition within the United States, and throughout the Middle East. And so Israel seems intent upon this invasion. And the U.S. has said it's not going to stand in Israel's way. But the world is looking for a different solution. And a ceasefire would be the first step to at least letting calmer heads prevail and saving a potential humanitarian catastrophe, which would be disastrous not only for Israel, in my opinion, but of course for the Palestinians.
Yes, right now we have our correspondent in Gaza, I believe. Let's cross over to Noor Harazeen, who is on the ground in Gaza. Noor, there's been growing concern of the effects on civilians, in particular the children, the women, the elderly. Tell us, you are there. What's the situation like now?
Well, this is not only the deadliest war between Gaza and Israel, but also it is Gaza's worst humanitarian crisis in its history. I mean, we have never ever witnessed anything like that. People, and we do not exaggerate when we say that they do not have access to water. The water bottles have run out from the markets. Even here at the hospitals, the water tanks are empty. Same thing in the mosques and the shelters. The only assistance that the people here in Gaza are getting are either from themselves, basically neighbors or relatives, or some UN workers who are working in the UN shelters and the UN schools. However, several UN schools were attacked by Israel. Several people who work with the UN UNRWA also have been killed here in Gaza. So, and at the same time, adding to all of this, the Rafah border is closed, even though Egypt had been promising since the beginning of this week that they will reopen the Rafah border and allow the humanitarian aid in. However, nothing is really happening here on the ground on Gaza. We were at Rafah border this morning and it was calm. No one was there except some journalists and media crews, except that everything is calm at the border. It is not open. There is no humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip. So this is the situation from my side.
So what is the expectation? You know, there are reports saying that the assistance or the aid has been delayed because of the inspection regime. Probably they won't have some or impose some proper inspection process. And then, you know, what else can people do to get the proper assistance? Just wait there?
Well, the people here, the civilians, the citizens, have reached the point where they just have to cope with whatever they face. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that fled their homes from northern Gaza and from central Gaza City to southern Gaza. However, there has been attacks here in southern Gaza. We have hundreds of thousands of people who fled their homes and took shelter in UN schools and in hospitals and in mosques, churches. However, all of these places were attacked by Israel. We have a number of UN schools, a number of mosques, churches yesterday, UN schools and hospitals. So people do realize that there is nowhere safe in Gaza. Same thing in when we are talking about the humanitarian aid. At the beginning, they were relieved, happy. However, now they have lost hope because over the past few days, Egypt have been saying and promising that the aid will enter the Gaza Strip. However, there is nothing here on the ground. So we can clearly say that the people are actually losing hope, the civilians here in Gaza, and they do believe that the humanitarian aid will not enter the Gaza Strip for at least a few more days.
Thank you, Noor. Let's turn to Wang Jin. Wang Jin, if you take a look at the situation and also if you look at the response from Israel, for example, their generals are telling their soldiers to be ready for a ground offensive against Gaza, the besieged area right now. What do we know about the offensive? You know, when will that happen? Will that happen with the consideration of protecting the civilians?
Well, I think on the one hand, unfortunately, I think it will happen. The very large wave of military operations from Israeli forces against Gaza might be very likely to be inevitable because Israel, after the early days of this round of crisis, usually they suffered a lot, and they hope that they could, to some extent, their social opinion and social public ideas, they hope that the Israeli government and the Israeli forces could revenge and could retaliate against the Hamas presence in Gaza. So unfortunately, I think after the calling of reserve armies and also deployment of the reserve armies, about more than 300,000 forces around Gaza, I think they will finally launch the attacks. So unfortunately, I think it will happen. But when it will happen, I think it might take longer time because actually, on the one hand, there were a lot of international pressure. Majority of the states in the international society, they hope that Israel could delay this kind of the round of ground forces against Gaza in the exchange of the human and the local civilians withdraw from north to south. So actually, it will take time, and because a lot of people, they have to gather their family, they have to find a road, they have to find enough shelters and food and supplies. So actually, the humanitarian corridors has not been successfully established. It will take time. And then on the other hand, from the perspective, it's really military decision makers. They need more time to gather information and intelligence about the Gaza targets, because we know that Israel withdrew from Gaza completely after 2005, and it has been nearly 2 decades that this area is without any Israeli or Jewish presence. So actually, the Israeli intelligence establishment, they need time to gather information, to gather intelligence. That will also take time. But unfortunately, I mean, no matter what happened, no matter how long it would take, I think Israeli forces, their military operation against Gaza will finally be launched. I hope that this kind of the military operation will not lead to large wave of humanitarian crisis for civilians in Gaza. That will become a very tragedy for civilians, for the local people there.
Wang Jin, so what is the purpose of this ground offensive? To wipe out the Hamas leadership or the Hamas entirely? But how do they tell, Hamas or from civilians? How do you make sure, they are Hamas? Okay, that's the one I'm going to retaliate against, but not somebody else.
I think it's also the very important topic that are still being debated inside Israel. Because on the one hand, we have already witnessed a lot of Israeli leaders, their speeches, their statement calling for the military forces of Israel, the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, to totally, completely eliminate the presence of Hamas in Gaza. This is, of course, is the political propaganda. This is the goal under this political the leadership. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, it might be very difficult task, because actually Hamas is not only the kind of the organization, it's actually the kind of ideology, it's a kind of the thinking to resist the occupation of Israel. So it is very difficult to distinguish very clearly who are the Hamas members or who are the Hamas supporters and who are the very, very pure civilians, especially after after the war. Once the very large ground forces attack started, it will maybe provoke more Palestinians in Gaza, more Palestinian civilians in Gaza. They might join the ranks of Hamas to resist the presence of Israeli defense or the military presence there. So actually, it will become a much more difficult task for Israeli forces to completely eliminate the presence of Hamas there. And meanwhile, I think maybe that Israel's purpose or Israeli aim will be to establish the kind of some buffer zone in the northern Gaza or in parts of the Gaza that neighbored Israeli territories in the prevent of possible attacks that's similar to what happened, nearly 2 weeks ago. That might be the very Israelis' purpose. But no matter what happened, it will lead to a large wave of humanitarian crisis for both the Israeli peoples as well as the Palestinians, especially locally in Gaza. And also it will lead to a lot of the casualties and the deaths, especially for the Israeli soldiers. It will become a tragedy for both Israelis and Palestinians themselves.
A tragedy for both sides. Peter, of course, as we know that, whatever the purpose, Israel has ordered more than, as you said, more than 1 million local people living in northern Gaza to move to the southern part of the strip. And then you have this, firm response, I would say, from Egypt. The president, al-Sisi, said on Wednesday that the current war is an attempt to push the civilian inhabitants to migrate to Egypt, and that would wreak peace in the region. So are we going to see a kind of like a deal similar to the one between Turkey and the EU? Okay, Egypt will host probably millions of people from Gaza somehow. Somebody or some country will pay for that?
I doubt it. The Egyptians have made clear they don't want any part of this kind of a deal. They might allow a small number in, but they've been pretty staunch in their opposition. the situation is going to get worse. In many ways, Hamas knew that Israel would have to retaliate, that Israel would, and they were hoping that Israel would overreact with a disproportionate response. So to turn the sympathy away from the Israelis who were brutally murdered by Hamas, to turn that sympathy into sympathy for the Palestinians who are now going to be brutally murdered by Israel. We were talking about the kind of situation inside Gaza. Human Rights Watch has called Gaza an open-air prison. Even before this latest round, 80% of the people in Gaza were living in poverty. 46% unemployment rate in Gaza. We're talking about horrific humanitarian conditions before the fighting. Now Israel has begun bombing the infrastructure there. When the Russians bombed the infrastructure in Ukraine, the United States condemned this and said this was war crimes. Now this is part of what Israel is doing already. But if they invade, we're talking about one of the most densely populated areas in the world. And we're talking about civilians living amidst all of these military targets with these tunnels underneath and the buildings being destroyed now. There's no way to avoid mass civilian casualties. Is Hamas willing to accept that? Yes. Hamas seems to be willing to accept that and almost to welcome that. Should Israel fall into that trap? We saw what happened when Israel invaded Lebanon, and it took them 20 years to get out. What's the end game for Israel? What are they thinking? What can they achieve? As our other guest said, Hamas is not just an organization, it's a movement. And you can't wipe out a movement. And the more they kill, the more future terrorists they're going to create, the more people who are going to hate Israel. So we need outside forces to intervene and try to impose a ceasefire and some kind of rapprochement regionally in the broader sense, just like we need in over Ukraine, just like we need over Taiwan at this point. And we need to have some kind of peaceful resolution, but the time seems to be wrong. Neither Hamas wants that, nor Israel wants that. And so we're going to play this deadly game out, but the humanitarian consequences are one thing. The other thing we have to consider is the possibility of this expanding into a regional war. If we see all the images of the Palestinians being slaughtered in Gaza, what does Hezbollah do? Hezbollah is 10 times as powerful as Hamas. Hezbollah has 100,000 armed troops. Hezbollah has a massive number of 150,000 rockets and missiles that they can use to overwhelm Israel and to attack Israel. And then if Hezbollah gets involved, does Iran get involved? Does Syria? Does Iraq? Does Yemen? I mean, we are looking at the possibility of a complete World War III emerging, or at least minimally a regional war. And the United States has 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. The United States will almost certainly be drawn in because Israel will be fighting minimally a 2-front war and possibly a several-front war. Israel can't do that despite how capable their military is. But we have to also remember that the Israeli military is more demoralized now, lower morale because of Netanyahu's horribly divisive policies inside Israel than it's been before. And that's why they were caught asleep, because their focus is not where it needed to be. Mm-hmm. And so the possibilities of this becoming an even worse situation are enormous.
Speak of the outside intervention, Peter, President Biden has been calling for emergency aid to both Ukraine and Israel. And the Senate has approved obviously the aid package there. But we know the House of Representatives is still to find a new speaker. So what will happen and what impact that will have on the current conflict?
Well, Biden is calling for $14 billion for Israel, $60 billion for Ukraine, also more funding for Taiwan and for the southern border in the United States. So overall, $100 billion package. But as you say, the U.S. Congress is in disarray. The Republicans do not want to govern, and they can't come up with a speaker they can agree on in the House. And so the Congress is right now at a stalemate. They can't pass anything. But Biden has other funds that he can draw on in an emergency. And he's been using that to supply funds to Ukraine. And in the short run, we'll be able to do some of that to support Israel. But in the long run, as you say, they can't. And the other problem, you saw they're not able to come up with the arms they want for Ukraine. They're several years behind in the arms they want to send to Taiwan. And so many of the arms that they're sending to Israel conflict with the arms that they want to send elsewhere. So, Biden's approach is to there's a lot of military spending, which benefits the U.S. military-industrial complex, because that's where the money really goes. But it is really not able to provide all of that now. So he's trying to rally the forces with his cry for military solutions to political problems. And the military solutions only create more problems.
Yes, it's a good point, Wang Jin. Do you agree? Now, do you think there's a need of a military solution to this long-term problem? It has been there for decades. Is the military the way forward, or we do something else probably to find a long-term solution to really solve the disputes, the conflicts between the two sides?
Yeah, yes, maybe from the perspective of some countries, the military solutions might be the only choice. But if we look at from the longer history, that the military solutions only harms both sides, because nobody will benefit finally from the military solution. Somebody may win sometime, but they were not able to win forever. And somebody could maintain the stability or safety from their own understanding for temporary time. But then if we look at the longer time, then finally they will be retaliated. They will be revenged. They will suffer the sudden attack of the other side and suffer the big losses. So from no matter what kind of the perspective, so military solutions can maintain only very temporary security of only some side, but not everyone. So if we want to find everyone that widely accepted solution, the only way is to go back to the negotiation table. The only way that the both sides should do to cease fire and to reorganize to find the solutions that could be accepted by both sides together. So I think in the future, maybe the peace process should come back. Maybe the mutual trust between Israel and the Palestinians should be constructed, and maybe the new mechanism of the Middle Eastern peace process, especially the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, should be introduced very urgently.
Yeah, very briefly, what are the likelihood of the conflict escalating into a regional war? Is the likelihood larger than 50%?
I think from now the war is still concentrated between Israelis and the Palestinian Gaza Strip, but with the larger wave, the humanitarian crisis erupted, especially in the very modern time, which we have the TikTok, we have the Twitter, we have a lot of apps that news could be live. The people who lost their lives, their sadness could be spread very quickly. It might be escalated into the regional crisis that then harms everybody in the Middle East.
So you are saying there's a real possibility.
Yeah.
All right, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.